RA, what's up, man? Welcome to the Dad Edge podcast, my friend.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you. I saw you speak here in St. Louis, which which was super cool. Really enjoyed that, and I'm excited to share some of your message today. But just for context, for maybe the five people in the audience that don't know who you are, if you want to share
Oh
share
boy.
a little bit about yourself currently, and then just some of the things you've done in your career, just to give the men some flavor of where you're at.
Sure. So presently, I'm not playing baseball anymore. I played for 21 years professionally and um, was able to play for about eight teams during that time. I think probably most people would know me from the New York Mets tenure, where I was able to uh, win a Cy Young, and so most people know about that. But truthfully, you know, where I am now is full-time father and husband, and own a 40-acre farm here, and taking care of the acreage, and being a dad to two girls who are 21 and 20, and two boys who are just turned 17 and 12. And so two are one's at University of Tennessee, where I went to school and my wife went to school, and then got a my 20-year-old is at Auburn, and then I've got two boys at a small Christian school here in Franklin, Tennessee, which is kind of where we have posted up. But we've been Nashvilleians our whole lives. So every off season we come back here, and we've got a network of people and a community of people that we really love and enjoy being around here. So that's kind of where I am now.
Very good, my friend. It's interesting. So I'm curious. 20 and 21. How far apart are they actually in age?
So they are so February. They're June to February. So whatever that is. So that would be like 14 months apart.
That is quick.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, they
So
were back to back pretty quick.
yeah, they were. So were they? Let me ask you this: Were they? Was the first couple of years? So like my two older ones, they're 20 months apart, and we found out basically almost right around my first one was a year old. We were pregnant again, and we weren't expecting it to be that fast. And I remember like it just seemed like the first 18 months after the second one was born, maybe even 2 years, that it just seemed a little bit like a blur. Like we were like, holy cow, like this is fast and furious. Did you experience the same?
Yes, yeah, absolutely did. I wouldn't say that we weren't not trying. We were okay with whatever happened, but I don't
Right.
think we were really prepared for how quickly it occurred.
Yeah.
Certainly was an incredible blessing, but you know, we it was blurry for sure. And I was trying to figure out, at that time I was a kind of a middling minor leaguer trying to make it to the major leagues, and so I was always training or gone or trying to play winter ball to learn something, or so it was hard too because we were apart quite a bit, in the early years especially.
Yeah, that is fast. That's very similar to our story as well. We actually had a lot of challenges getting pregnant with our first one, and it took us
Hmm.
almost 3 years. And without going into a whole lot of detail, but basically the doctors told my wife and I, my wife has had endometriosis really bad, and the doc was
Yeah,
like, hey, you guys probably aren't going to get pregnant on your own. The first one we needed some help, and then the second one he was
yeah,
like, you guys are probably going to have to come back, just to let you know it's going to be a long shot. And then we kind of did the same thing. We're like, well, whatever happens happens. And then the other three just happened. So, but it happened a lot
yeah.
faster
Oh
than
my
I
goodness.
thought. So what
Yeah. Well, I mean, our story's similar like that. I mean, my wife had
really?
endometriosis really badly too,
Yeah.
and we had a couple of miscarriages before we had our first, and doctors were giving us similar prognosis, and so all our babies we feel like are. I mean, they're all miracle babies, but all of ours we feel like we were beating the odds every time.
Yeah. Yeah. Same, it's, I didn't know that about you, but yeah, that it's the same story with us too. And
Yeah.
we luckily, knock on wood, we didn't need any help with the next three. They came pretty
That's
fast and furious.
great.
But us too. We dealt with miscarriages in the beginning. You've been married now 25 years, right?
Yeah, yeah. 25. We just celebrated it
Yeah.
in December. December 13th, 1997 was when we got married, right before my second spring training, basically.
Oh boy. Yeah, we just celebrated 20. Let's do this. Let me throw a fun question your way. Let's just say that your phone is a time portal. Okay. And
Okay,
you can call anybody you want from the past. Okay. So
okay,
here's what you're going to do. You're going to call yourself up in 1996 and you're going to say, "Hey, RA,
okay.
this is me, dude. This is you from the future. All right. 25 years ahead of you right now. You're about ready to get married next year. I'm going to give you some gold advice right now that is going to save you a lot of frustration, a lot of headache. And here's what I'm going to tell you." What would you be telling yourself?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think I was just such a bad communicator early on in our marriage. I think that would be the wake up call I try to give myself is work hard at learning how to communicate well within the context of a Christ centered marriage. I think for me, I fell down a lot early on because I really never had modeled for me, um, what a good husband looked like. My parents were divorced early. I kind of was a latchkey kid. I grew up all over the place and never really had a stable kind of role modelish uh, paradigm to kind of look to and say, oh, well, that's how you should treat a woman, and that's how you should communicate, and so I had to learn a lot of it on the fly. Now I could pretend pretty good, and I was good at making you think one thing. But when it push came to shove, I really fell down a lot because I just didn't possess the equipment to know how to, at that time in my life, to know how to communicate with my wife very well. And that caused a lot of problems early in our marriage for sure.
That's the number one thing that I hear from men in our community. I mean, we've been doing this now for, gosh, almost 10 years. And when it comes to parenting, I always ask men, hey, if you could improve, well, if you could wave a magic wand and just improve one thing overnight, what would it be? And it's always patience. And then for
Yeah.
marriage, I hear communication. And then usually when I ask, like, well, what would make communication better for you? And they're like, well, I just want better communication or I want deeper communication. So it's kind of like these really high level adjectives that don't really
Yeah.
get to like, I think the granular part of like, okay, it's not just better and more and deeper. This is actually how you get better, more and deeper. So what were some of the lessons that you've learned in 25 years that actually, when you and your wife are talking, it's like, hey, I need to make sure that we're doing these things and that allow us to
Yeah.
have that better communication? What would they be?
Yeah. No, I think that's real insightful. I think a lot of times you have this macro, you know, kind of philosophy around those big adjectives, right? And then you try to reduce it to these micro ways of real life application on, how do you really engage your wife in a way that you communicate well? And look, I still fall down and I have nothing figured out fully. And so all this is to a little bit, you know, like I'm still working on the things that I'm about to try to share with you. But I think, originally it's be honest. Like for me, like learning how to be honest with where I am, what I'm doing, how I'm feeling. I kind of developed all these mechanisms because of my past on how to kind of stuff things down and compartmentalize things. And I would go places mentally and I'll check out on her in a lot of ways that, I would just be kind of this, blank guy who didn't really have much to, you know, lend that was very dynamic to the marriage. And so, learning to be able to communicate around that was a real big hurdle for me. And I think now I do that a lot better. If I'm having a day where I'm reflecting on some stuff in my past, and like if you were at the Legacy Builders thing, like I went through a lot of tough stuff when I was young, and a lot of times I have a tough time not circling back to that a lot. And it takes me to a place where, I'm not the great to be around, and I have to communicate that, like I have to, and my wife is incredible. She knows me that way now. And that's been a process. And she knows when to give me space and when to press in. And a lot of that is centered around me being a lot more intentional about communicating honestly, and not being afraid of the fallout from that, in a real safe place with her. And it takes two, right? Like, so she, for me, for a long time, not by anything that she had done, I didn't consider her a very safe place to go. And that was my own stuff. And so
Yeah.
once we really built that safe place in our marriage where I could be honest and not feel judged, or I could be honest and not have to worry about hurting her feelings, because she knew my story and she knew it was much more about me than her. Then we started taking some real giant steps, and, growing closer, and, really having a more meaningful marriage, if that's even, I mean, that's the way that I see it, like we were married, but like how are we being grown up in Christ through what I consider the sharpest tool in God's belt to cultivate us as human beings, and that's marriage. I feel like there's no sharper arrow in the quiver for God than marriage, as far as how to, this side of the curtain, how to, chip away rough edges and expose in us the things that we need to get better at. And so for me, that was one thing: be honest, two, be intentional, three is, really build in time to be those things, instead of just, like going through your day and not catching up. So we have time. We'd like to eat together a lot, so we eat together a lot, and that's a good time for us to do that. That's a real life tangible application, on the micro scale, that really helps us to connect. We're lucky now that we have mornings together after the kids have gone to school, where we'll come back and really get to connect well, and around that. And that's good. And the other thing too, I would say is, we she does a much better job at this than I do, but she talks about dreams a whole lot, like to keep dreaming. We've been married 25 years, and you think, well, there's not much more to live for. Like, this is it. Like, this is the routine.
False,
This is,
right?
yeah, right. So
Yeah.
super false. And so she dreams big. And, me, even though I fight back against that, because I fall, I'm an athlete, so I fall back into the discipline of a routine. And, I enjoy that part. I sometimes shut down that piece of me that likes to still dream about the rest of our lives together. And so that's recognizing her attribute in that, is a big deal too. And those things have been very helpful for our marriage.
Man, that's really good. Just you mentioned a lot of things in here, and I want to go back to your past here in a few minutes, but I want to pick apart some things that you really said there. I honestly think that society has taught men, shove it down, put your head down, don't talk about it, and just be on your merry way. And I always joke about it, but it's really serious. Like, is that when we ask guys like, "Hey man, how you doing?" "Good, fine, busy." Those are the three words, like our
Yeah.
three most. You mentioned the word quiver. I love that because it always archery and where we're aiming. But like those are the three words that are in a man's quiver. That are easily accessible to give you. But it's not a true it's not a true identification, or it's not a true way of even communicating well. And when we can peel back those onion layers and be
Hmm.
more authentic with our wives, because to be quite honest, I think a lot of men confuse, like, well, if I'm authentic with my wife, that means I'm like this feminine sponge that really doesn't feel good, and I'm emotional and I'm crying. Like, it doesn't have to mean that whatsoever. And you just emulated that perfectly, which is like, hey, if I can be intentional, if I can pick times, if I can be honest. You also mentioned this safe place. Some men growing up have come from trauma where, and I have too. I mean, where we don't want to talk about these things because, man, it's like, God bless, if she knew that I was feeling this way, what if she heads out too? Or what if this happens again? It doesn't matter what trauma it is, but for men who haven't been through significant trauma, it's still hard. But men who have been through trauma like you have, it's really hard, And I would love to just give you whatever freedom you want to just share about your past, about some of the things that you did walk through as a kid that were very unexpected and traumatic.
Yeah, sure. So, one of the impediments for me once I started contemplating marriage to Anne, who's my wife, was that I was scared to death that if I told the truth about where I'd come from, what had happened to me, where I had been, that I would lose her. And so I never was honest about, uh, I suffered through some sexual abuse when I was very young, 8 years old, 9 years old. And when that happens to you, if you're listening, I can empathize with, especially if you've never done the work around trying to, heal and be redeemed from a lot of that stuff, is that your growth is stunted at the time that you suffer the trauma. So I was basically an 8-year-old boy and a 22-year-old man, without the emotional development, the spiritual development, the mental development, because I couldn't get out of that place. Now I could trick people, I could present, but I was a chameleon in a lot of ways because I didn't want anybody to see what was really going on, the angst and anguish and the reflection and the shame, which is, I will say to you, uh, if God has the arrow of marriage to really refine us, the enemy has the arrow of shame in a man's life to really stunt him into keeping him from becoming the man that God has ultimately called him to be. And I was experiencing a ton of that, and that shame would really stifled my growth in a lot of ways. And so as I matured physically and became a really good athlete, did all these things, I also matured in my ability to develop equipment that could keep people at arm's length, including my wife, right? Including the people that I wanted to be close to, because of the fear and shame around, hey, if they know this about me, they're going to throw their hands up and run as fast as they can the other way. And I don't want that. Like I want to keep them from doing that. So I learned how to be dishonest. I learned how to be manipulative. I learned how to be condescending. I learned how to be smart. I learned how, in an effort to elevate myself and to a position where people wanted to be near me and around me, but yet not really know me fully and deeply and intimately. And so I was super good. I was really good at those tools, with those tools that I had developed, and um, it caused a lot of harm. It caused a lot of harm in my life, in relationship. Ultimately, I deceived my wife and tricked her into marrying someone she had no idea about my past, and so she was coming into a marriage that I had a ton of baggage that we had dealt through, and I haven't dealt personally, and it really wrecked us early on in our marriage. Now, I think she would say, she wished that she would have done some things differently, but I know that I am saying publicly, like, and have for many, many years since I've done the work around my abuse, that I carried the burden for a long time of being less than who I needed to be in our marriage for a long time. For the first decade of our marriage, I was a mess and didn't know where to go. And God brought me to the end of myself through that trauma and through that constant internal battle that was always going on, that would come out in so many toxic ways in my marriage. And ultimately, I got to a place where I just I didn't want to keep going, man. I was I was too tired and hurt, and I was tired of hurting people. I was tired of beating myself up. I was tired of all these different things, and I wanted to end it all, man. And I mean, like, I was really close a couple of different times, and it wasn't until I really felt God, uh, you know, provide an incredible encounter with somebody that helped pull me out of that place and start doing the real work around how to be a father and a husband, and knowing my identity, who I was in Christ, and what God really thought of me. And when that work started to occur, my marriage started to bloom in ways that I'd never thought possible. Um, and that's kind of how my past took me to that climactic point, that point where it could have gone one of two ways, and God intervened in a real special way in my life.
I would love to hear all about that. And, just some reflections on some of the things that you said. You know, I look at some of the things that you were talking about, as far as things that you would do early on. You mentioned I would be condescending, I'd be nice, I would be, I would manipulative even at times, right? And
Mhm.
I think, for someone who's been through trauma, I don't think there's any ill intent that's associated with like I'm going to go do this thing because it's malicious or it's evil. It's truly out of survival. I mean,
Yeah,
it's like this is the person
yeah,
I have to be so I am not hurt again, right? And and I went through that too. My wife, who sounds like Anne, her name's Jessica, incredibly patient, incredibly forgiving, a lot of grace, and Anne and Jessica sound a lot alike, and she's taught me a lot about this and where we were even in our relationship, which goes back to 1996. We're completely different worlds apart, and I know personally that the work that I had to do and the aha moments that I had, and it's transformed our relationship. But for you, I'm so curious. It sounds like you had an encounter, it sounds like, with someone that God brought to you, and this, maybe it was this person or this process that really helped you transform. But I'm so curious, what was that moment for you, and most importantly, what were some of those aha moments that you started implementing in your relationship with Anne that really brought you guys back together?
yeah. Well, so I was, you know, in my car, and I had a garden hose taped to the tailpipe, and it was running my driver's side window, and I had a towel tucked around it. I was ready to go and, turn the key, and I felt like this real, just the only way I know how to describe it is, I'd come to know Christ early on in my life. When I say early on, I mean, I got the idea around who Christ was, but never really developed a relationship, but felt as if I had accepted him as my savior at the very least, like, you know, and that was when I was 13 years old. But never really cultivated that relationship very deeply. But the only way I can explain is, I felt the Holy Spirit really urging me not to turn the key, and thankfully I listened. And the next morning, I was in a house, and our house, and Anne had moved into another house, and we were just trying to figure it out. And I was in a bad way, and so I was living on my own, and she was living on her own for a period of time. And the pastor of my church showed up at my door, and started talking to me about some things that were real deep and intimate. I don't know how he knew to say what he said. I can only say it was divine intervention for sure. And he pointed me to another guy who eventually became this relationship for me that really helped transform the lens that I now am able to look through. And he was a counselor here in Nashville, and I just got paired with him, by God's grace. And the thing that really, and he was really, really good at his job. And so he knew when I was BSing him and giving him Sports Center answers. And, he could tell he had done a lot of, he was just really good. He
Yeah.
knew that there was something in there that had needed to come out, and he kept pressing in and kept pressing in. And I kept using like you said, all my survival tools, to misdirect. And, I just didn't, I was scared that nobody knew about my abuse. Nobody knew how difficult it was in my past. Nobody on earth, because I had never shared it. And ultimately, he looked at me one day and he said, he said, "Man, listen, uh, I know that you have had a lot of pain in your life, and you've had a sense of loneliness that is so deep that I can't really understand, but I want you to hear me." And he said these words, and it changed me forever on that moment. In that moment, he said, "Listen, no matter what you tell me, no matter what you say, like I'm not going anywhere. Like that was it. Like I'm not gonna. And to hear that from a man too, like, because I was abused by a male. And so those relationships for me were like off limits. Like any depth of relationship with another man were off limits for me in my mind and heart forever, for the longest time until I met Stephen. And when he spoke those words, it just penetrated to my core, man. And I was able to tell him kind of what had happened. And we started a journey on that day that lasted probably 2 years, and still lasted. He became a really good friend and stopped being my counselor, and he would come on the road with me, and we would get to go deep and talk, and that was really the genesis to, you know, how I was able to kind of walk through some of the trauma that had occurred to me, but it wasn't for another year until I did my own work that I could bring my wife into it. And so when I brought my wife into it, I had to be prepared for her to walk away from the marriage. And so that was a real hard day. I remember walking in to my counselor's office, and she was coming with me, and I was going to tell her about what had happened to me early on and all the things that I kind of walked through and lied about and kept from her and hid from her and the reasons why. And I was going to lay it all out there. And I had to fully be prepared for her to walk out. At this time, we had 2 kids, and um, a third one was on the way. And so it was a really tough day for me. But when I walked in and I laid bare my soul to her, my expectation was that she was going to walk away from the marriage, and she had every right to. Uh, but what she did was the opposite, right? And it melted me in a way that was another climactic point for me. So if I could point to two different instances or two different climaxes in my life that really changed my stars, it would be, doing work with a man one on one in a way that was transforming. And then hearing my wife say, like, none of that matters to me. Like, I see you and I know who you are. And I love that piece of you that's created in God's image, that I can see that piece of you that's a good man. And I want to stay in it. Those two moments for me, you know, opened up the door for a different life. But you got to remember, I had walked from 8 until 32, on a path where nobody knew anything, and so I had a lot of work to do and still do. So I'm still in process. I know that's a long circuitous route to take you through, but that's kind of been my journey with in my marriage and just trying to heal from a lot of tough stuff.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem.
I want to I want to lob a question at you to think about, and and while you think about it, I just want to share a story that is significantly less traumatic, but I also think it hits home the desire for our wives to be fully transparent and be the man that we were meant to be. So my question is when that happened after the fact, I would love to know, what are some things that you noticed that started to transform in your relationship immediately and then also over time? And as you think about that, back in 2000, I came from a pretty traumatic childhood myself, where my mother was still to this day suffers from alcoholism, and
Mhm.
was a revolving door of dads. She was married 3 times. Didn't know my
Mhm.
biological father. Actually ran into him by accident when I was 30 in a coffee shop. And we
Oh
started
man.
our relationship then. Actually, my dad was sitting next to me in the during your event at Legacy Builders. So that was pretty
Oh,
surreal.
amazing.
But the reason I'm doing what I'm doing today is because of I know what it's like to not only be raised without a father, but also toxic father figures that abuse the hell out of you, right?
Yeah.
But in 2017, something really interesting happened. Jessica and I had been married for at that time. We had been married for 14 years, and I went through, I didn't know it at the time, but I was training for an ultra event, and I was training for about 15 months. And I was training very irresponsibly, and was training way too hard, and basically fried out my adrenal system, and couldn't sleep for
Mm,
33 days. I slept an hour and a half, 2.5 hours at most every night for 33 straight days until I was actually went to the hospital for 4 days after that, because I had
good grief.
my physical, mental, emotional health was literally had just tanked. But that entire process, you stare at the ceiling for 6 to 7 hours a night with nothing but your thoughts when it's quiet. That's going to drive you absolutely crazy. And I
Mm-hmm.
had PTSD. I was actually diagnosed with PTSD after I left the hospital. I had to go through 9 months of counseling. So they deemed it as a traumatic event. And what I didn't want to bring Jessica into the mix of is how high my anxiety was. Cause I was like, put your head down, keep going, don't complain, don't be negative, don't worry her. She saw you go through this crazy thing. She's already got enough on her plate. We have 4 boys, just man up, be quiet, and go. And it
Mm,
was fascinating, man. I've known my wife now for 27 years, been married for 20, and my wife has never said anything that she said to me about 9 months after that event, because I was very distant from her. She'd be like, "Are you
mm,
like, what's going on?" "I'm good. I'm fine. Good, fine, good, fine, whatever." And I just kept her at bay. I didn't want to let her know like how bad I was suffering, because like every night I went to bed for like 9 months. I was underneath immense anxiety. What if this happens again? What if this happens again? And I wasn't myself, and I wasn't bringing her into how bad I was hurting. And
sure.
one day, man, and maybe this is what happened with you and Ann to some degree, but she sat me down. She's like, "We need to talk." I was like, "Okay." And I wasn't expecting this. And she goes, "I never thought I'd say this to you. And it's hard for me to tell you this, but you're losing me." And I'm like, "What?" She's like, "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not saying divorce, but I'm starting to have thoughts and feelings about life without you." And I'm like,
Mm,
I was like, "What? Why would you say that?" She's like, "Larry, you're not the man I married. You're not, you, I know." She's like, "I know you better than you know yourself. And I know you're hurting, and I know that there's a lot going on, and you are not bringing me into it, which tells me you don't trust me enough to go to battle with whatever it is that you're facing. And I don't even know how bad it is." And she's like, "How do you expect me to be your queen? You're my king. How do you expect me to be your queen if you don't let me in on the battle plan? Like, if you don't let me in on what we're facing here, how do you expect me to help?" And it also just shows that I feel like you don't trust me enough. Like I can't handle it, which is insulting to me. She's like, "Cause I
mm,
can." And hearing that I was losing my wife, never thought I'd hear that one. It really made me realize, wow, I think that I'm protecting her, and I'm doing all these mechanisms, right, to protect myself and quote unquote protect her. But what I'm actually doing is that I'm losing my wife because of this thing that I feel that I have to be as a man. And dude, I crumbled, and I just was like, all right, here it is. And the interesting thing is that the way Anne met you at that moment when you told her was the same that Jessica
mm-hmm.
met me. And she's like, "Okay, well, great. Thank you. Now I know. Let's go." And
Yeah.
we really evolved from there. But there was something very freeing that happened when I unpacked all that, and I didn't want to. But it made us evolve in our relationship. And I look back on it, and I'm just like, man, that's when communication got better. That's when things got more honest. That's when things got more intentional, and beautiful things came out of that suffering together. But back to the question, when you had that moment with her, what were some things that you realized right away, and then even that trickled into years ahead?
Well, I think the very first thing that stuck out was um, like it's okay to be vulnerable with my wife. I think that was something that I never really understood.
Yeah.
I didn't think, like you said, we're taught even if it's and from watching Rambo and all these movies that we grow up with, like what makes a man's man, like stick your head down, keep grinding, like and there are certain times in our lives as men, that we're called to do that in a way that is sacrificial for sure, 100%. But you're always working on what the balance is, right? So, you know, with me, I was all, I'm gonna outlast you, I'm gonna outwork you, I'm gonna out, like that was my mentality through everything, including,
Yeah.
in my marriage. And what I started to realize was like being vulnerable and open, and like there's a lot that of freedom in that. Like, to use your words, it was very freeing for me to be able to share my burden, with the person that God had called me to be with the rest of my life, and I had not done that. I thought I needed to be Superman and do everything and make every dollar and change every diaper and like do every, like I work like a works based kind of relationship. And my wife really just wanted a more intimate, more deep, more vulnerable, more transparent, less superficial type of relationship, which are all great things. And I couldn't figure that piece out until, a decade into our marriage. But things that, I think vulnerability was one immediate thing. Two is the whole bit about being honest. I think that goes along with being vulnerable, like being honest with how I'm feeling that day, and also reassuring her, because she brings, and your wife and Jessica probably brings in her own set of uh, things from her story of origin, whatever that
Sure.
is, right? Like we both have that, to reassure my wife that, this is not about you, right? Like this is not about what you have or haven't done. You haven't done anything to upset me. I'm just upset. And so to be able to communicate that, she knows it's not about her. It's just me dealing with the grief of loss and the grief of, trauma. So we got to figure that piece out where she had never had an opportunity to join me in those spaces before. It was just, she always thought it was about her, like her not performing well, her doing something that upset me, her, whatever it was, because of her story of origin. That's kind of where she comes from. And it was triggering all those things for her. And so there was never real any real intimate, pure, godly communication in our marriage. And that's why when you said, what would you say to that, and I'm going to call him a boy, that boy, when I was 22 years old getting married, or 23 years old getting married, that's what it, communication, like honest communication, sincere, authentic, honest communication, uh, is something that really was helpful.
Do you think that for most couples, I think some couples view their relationship as I can get to a certain level, but I can't get quite that deep. And a lot of it has to do with fear, right? Fear. And
Yeah,
I think that this is an incredible way that actually men can lead. Like I think a lot of us have this vision or this notion that leadership means, well, then I have to be quote unquote maybe calling the shots, or I have to teach leadership skills. But leading can also be like, I'm going to be the one to go first here,
yeah.
and deepen the relationship and be the vulnerable one, be the authentic one, and see what happens. Do you think that perhaps most men, that's where we could start, is like, hey, I just need to be willing to go first at times?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things for sure. I think, I, I say this all the time because I really believe it. I think I give my kids an incredible gift when I am contrite in front of them. So if I've harmed them in some way, yeah, I mean, the tendency as a man is to kind of double down and say, make a reason for it, or, you know, just tell them, hey, this is what I really meant, but you got to know that, this is. And so when I say that, when I repent in front of them, or I repent to my wife in front of them, I give them a real gift, right? But that takes a lot of vulnerability. That takes a lot of self-awareness. That takes a lot of the things that I wasn't able to do early in my process, um, that I feel like I'm better at now. I'm still working on it, of course, but being able to understand. that it's okay to make mistakes and be wrong and not have all the answers. Um, it's contrary to what the enemy wants us to feel as men. Like I think the enemy does a great thing for himself by making us feel like if we don't have all the answers, we should be ashamed. Instead of saying, "Hey, I don't, I'm sorry, I messed that up. Like I should have never spoken that way or said that thing or, treated you that way publicly or whatever it is." You diffuse so much when you're able to be that vulnerable within the confines of your marriage and your family. And so that takes a lot of, like you said, I mean, you got to be vulnerable to do that. You've got to have a real uh, understanding about how safe your marriage is. And I mean, all kinds of dynamics are going on that are healthy in that paradigm. And so those are the things that I've really felt like have been transforming in my marriage and relationally with my children. Like they look to me for answers and I want them to. But when I say that I don't have an answer, but I'd love to walk with you through what an answer may be, that gives them a real gift, right? Like they understand that, hey, it's okay that I don't know everything because here's the question. The real question that we're all asking, especially from ages, 12 to 20 to now, even now, I ask the
Yeah.
same questions at 48 is, do I have what it takes?
Yeah.
Do I have what it takes? Like that's the question. The question that we're all asking, well, at the foundational levels is, do I have what it takes? Do I have what it takes to be a man, to be a provider, to be a good husband? Do I have what it takes to be, you know, a good Christian man? Do I have what it takes to succeed in my vocation? Do I have what it takes to be a good son or daughter? Like, do I have what it takes? And in the moment, the quicker that we can get to the place where we can answer that authentically and unabashedly, no, I do not have what it takes. And that's why I need a savior that does. Then that levels the playing field and takes so much pressure off you as a child that's developing and trying to learn all these great assets that you need to survive in our culture and beyond. It unloads the burden of that question. So when you can diffuse that question of, like, because we are programmed to want to have what it takes. I want to have what it takes. I want to have what it takes to be successful. I want to have what it takes to be a good husband. And I do not have what it takes. And that's why I need a relationship with the living God, because he does have what it takes. And I can turn to him because I don't have answers and I can be okay not having the answers. And I can tell my kids and my wife, hey, honey, like, I'm not too sure on this one. Let's see what scripture says on that. Or, hey, Eli, who's my 16-year-old, hey, man, I, it's hard to talk about masturbation. I don't have the answers. Let's look in scripture and see what that says, right? Like if I pretend that I have all the answers, it's only going to harm him. It's only going to harm him, and I'm going to have the wrong answer. So I just think helping to diffuse that question that we all have internally of, do I have what it takes, by answering, no, I don't. And that's why I need a savior. That's why I need a God who can help me through my journey this side of eternity. And that's a real gift that you can give, I think. It's been a gift for myself. It's freed me up. And when I started to answer that question, uh, in a vulnerable way by saying, like, as much as I want to have what it takes, I don't. My career, like my career as a baseball player, went from here to here. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Like the freedom that I felt to go out there and just be who I was called to be authentically and not worry about results. I became much more process oriented. All I cared about was, if I threw 120 pitches in a game, I wanted to devote myself to 120 different commitments on a micro level. And then ultimately I could be satisfied because I went through the process right. If the result was bad, well, at least I committed to the process and I was okay. Like, so that's a big piece, I think. Well, let me say this: it has been a big piece for me to be able to answer that question with my children and my family.
It makes so much sense. Two big themes that are really emerging as you're talking is, the spiritual warfare that the enemy likes to use, shame and pride, right?
Mm,
So
yeah.
not being enough, right? That's a true fear for all of us, no matter what level we're operating at in life. I will not be enough. I'll be left alone and unloved. Like that's the deepest fear of any human being. If you really want to torture a human being, put them in isolation, right?
Yeah,
And
sure.
you know, I think it's you talk about these authentic moments, right? With kids. You mentioned even that you will publicly apologize, to Anne in front of the kids. I actually do things very, very similar. I apologize to my kids all the time. And I think what that does is, that shows true authenticity, true humility. And the cool thing is and I'm sure you probably have seen this in your own kids, but what I've noticed is that, and I did this not even intentionally early on. I've just have always been one of those people that I just apologize. It's one of the few gifts that I have, that if I'm just humble when it comes that way. But one thing I've noticed accidentally, I didn't expect this, is that my boys, it's always extreme ownership with them. I'm like, hey, what happened here? And they're like, and a lot of times it's like, I apologize. Zero excuses. I should have done this, this, or this.
Mm.
Normally, what I would expect out of a normal teenager is like, well, this was going on, or it was his fault or her fault. And it really wasn't me, but I
Oh
never
yeah.
really get that. But I think when we're real, right? Fathers, husbands, our kids see that, it encourages them and inspires them to be more real, which I think is a true gift. You know, Going back to well, first of all, I want to go, I want to talk about your kids. Have you noticed a shift? Or that's a dumb question. What shifts have you noticed in the relationship with your kids since you've been just obviously more transparent, more authentic, intentional, everything that you've been talking about? What's been some big aha moments with your kids?
Well, that's a good question. And I think there's a different answer, obviously. Well, maybe not obviously, but between my daughters and my sons. You
Oh,
know, I
right.
think
Yeah.
I think with my daughters, um, some of that vulnerability has really helped to shepherd, um, their what to look for in a man. I think
Yes.
that's important. Like my kids are at the age now where if they're looking at a relationship, they're looking to see I'm not wasting my time anymore. Like I'm looking for attributes that would are going to be lifelong attributes for a mate. I mean, it's not just like we're going out just to go out. I'm looking, right? Like I'm vigilant. And one of the things I'm vigilant for is, is this man self-spirited? Does he have a self-spirited and kind heart? Right. And I think one of the things that, being vulnerable with your kids, at least my daughters, I've seen this, is that they know how to identify a kind heart and a lowly spirit, which is what God calls us to have, right? Like my best, and I tell them all the time, my strongest posture is on my knees, right? Like it's
Yeah.
not standing up pretending to have all the answers, and I want to have answers for you guys, and hopefully I will through God's grace. But you also need to know that I am not my own. Like I lean on the Lord for everything that I try to teach you. I want to have that wisdom, and so it helps them to identify the traits that they need to be looking for in another man. If I'm able to, you know, exemplify that for them. So I think I've noticed that as a shift. Like they have a really good barometer for the kind of people that they want in their lives, and not because I'm any great thing, but they can because they too are created in God's image and know who they are as children of the living God. They're able to recognize that more, um, you know, in real time because they've seen it in the home, and that's always been my hope with my boys. My hope is that they will be able to. Uh, and the thing that I've seen is that they have a real heart for relationship. Where I grew up, and the more honest I've been in my own story with them, and I have one that's 12 and one that's 17. Women love relationship anyway. It's inherent. Men normally love things. Like that's just that if you like all the data points to that. Men love things, women love people. And you got to fight back against that as a man a lot of times. And so if I can be real with my boys, the thing that I have noticed is they really love relationship. They love to socialize with people that are like-minded. They love to ask. They like to be curious. I think that's something that I've really noticed. They're much more curious than most kids their age. Like they want to know about a human being. They want to know, how somebody's doing. They can feel empathy that like if you're open in the home and you're vulnerable with your story and they don't feel judgment or condemnation in the house, you don't exasperate your children, then all of a sudden they start to be real curious in relationship about, and they can recognize when somebody's hurting. They can recognize what questions to ask to help. And I've noticed that in both my boys. I think that's one thing, and that's a great question. That's one thing that I really hope, because that's countercultural to what we
Yep.
see masculine attributes to be, right? We don't want to check on people. We want to be, we want to be in charge. I mean, you said it, pride, right? I would add to that, like, power, right? Like we want power as men. We want power as a community of men. Normally, that's what's inherent in us. And so to be able to use whatever power that God's given them for the greater good, that's the hope for my boys. Because ultimately they're going to be in a position of leadership, even if it's just in the framework of their marriage. And so that's important. So those two things. So for my daughters, I think just, the ability to recognize worthwhile attributes in relationship. And for my boys, it's just really being open and empathetic. I think empathy is a huge thing, man. I can't, in my own experience, being able to sit with somebody in their grief, not trying to fix it, just sitting there and being available. And all the times, like I had a situation yesterday with my 17-year-old. We got home from an event and it was late. And he said he had a buddy that had called him and wanted to meet at Sonic and talk. And it was just because he wanted to listen to the kid, right? Like he didn't have any real hidden agenda. He just wanted to be there for the kid. And that's something I think is a byproduct of, being honest and open in the home and sharing your own story and your own shortcomings and your own fallout. I think that's been real helpful.
Oh man, I love that you really put a spotlight on, what this does for the daughters and what this does for the sons. I was actually going to ask you that later here in the interview, so I'm so
Mm,
glad you touched upon that. But I really think, to agree with you even more, is that for men who are raising daughters, I'm not one of them, but I'm going to have daughter-in-laws one of these days, right? But for
mm.
men who are raising daughters, a huge reminder is we actually set the bar, right, for what it is that they're potentially going to tolerate later on in their own relationships, right? And
Yeah.
the same for our boys too, right? I mean, my wife and I, Jessica and I, and I'm sure you and Ann are probably feel the same way we do, which is, you know, I am me. I am the example of how a godly man treats his wife, right? And I follow
Yeah.
certain there are guardrails, man, that I do not cross, right? Respect and how we communicate. I don't raise my voice to her, right? I don't call her name. I've never called my wife a name ever. She's never called me a name. The cool thing about this too is my wife has the same exact core value when it comes to that core values when it comes to this, meaning she's like, it's my responsibility to show these boys, these young men, what it looks like for a woman to love her man, right? And
Yeah.
to show him respect. How do I treat him? How do I talk to him? How do I communicate with him? How affectionate I am with him? How do I appreciate him, respect him? All these things that are so important, because that way I'm setting the bar for what they're going to settle for, right? Or what they're going to expect in a
Mm-hmm.
relationship. So I love the fact that you hit that home. As we wrap up here, I would love to give the audience a bit of a fun journey into your career in baseball. We've talked about a lot of serious things and a lot of vulnerability, and man, I really appreciate that. But the interesting thing about every, high level athlete or celebrity I've had on here is, everybody looks at them as like, oh, R.A. Dickey, he was the knuckleball man, right? He was always operating at the highest level possible. Like there was never a bad day. But your journey into actually even throwing the knuckleball wasn't this linear journey. It was fascinating how it actually happened. I would love for you to share that.
Well, it's fascinating to me too, how it happened. I reflect on it a lot, especially now that I'm not playing anymore. In the moment, you're so wrapped up in trying to survive it. And I love what you said at the beginning of kind of our talk, just to kind of circle back to that. I think it's an important thing to mention is, because it was the same in my vocation as it was in my marriage. And that's this idea around survival, right? Like you're just trying to survive when you've had the trauma and you haven't done the work, and you're just coming up with all these weapons and mechanisms to be able to survive. And then as you start to enter into your work and you start to become more and more self-aware and more vulnerable, and you start to see kind of the things that are healthy, you start becoming more of a craftsman, right? Like you start to be able to see how things should work and the benefit of doing it the right way. And so you make this graduation from survivor to craftsman in your marriage and your vocation. Like for me, in my vocation as well, I was just trying to survive. I was a mediocre major leaguer at best. I'd even say below average. I mean, I was able to get to the big leagues as a conventional pitcher, but I could never stay because I just wasn't quite good enough. Um, but then ultimately, you hope to graduate from craftsman to like a genuine artist, right? Like, so you're going from survivor to craftsman to artist. And that artist piece for me is, how do you live fully in who God's called you to be? Well, to your point, I started just surviving. I was drafted in the first round as a conventional pitcher at University of Tennessee. I played on the Olympic team. I played in Atlanta. Like I had all these great, things that had happened in my baseball career, but I could never really make it conventionally as a major leaguer, as a conventional pitcher. So in 2005, I was playing for the Rangers, and Buck Showalter was my manager, and Oral Hershiser was my pitching coach, and they recognized in me something that I really couldn't see myself. And you need the people like that, right? Like you need people like that in your life that can see things about you that you can't see yourself, right? Because you're too close to it. They knew I had a good knuckleball, but I never thought about becoming a full-time knuckleballer like Tim Wakefield or Phil Necro or anything like that. But I was at the end of my rope as a conventional pitcher. I'd just given up 4 or 5 runs for the Anaheim Angels, and I got called in the office, and they were about to send me down. I knew it or release me, and I had this empty feeling in my heart. And what's crazy? It corresponded in 2005 was when I started entering into the work on myself. It's when I became vulnerable with my wife. It's when I started to do the work around my abuse. Like all of it happened at the same time.
Wow.
And so in 2005, they're like, hey, man, we think you could be a good knuckleballer. We want you to go down to AAA and start that journey. And what that meant was I was having to leave the thing that I had always been behind. I had to take my ego out and say, this pitcher that I was drafted as, and that I was an All-American as, and that I was an Olympian as, I'm no longer that guy. And I have to become something new if I want to really have a chance. And my gosh, what an incredible parallel to what I was walking through as a human being. I had to leave that old person behind and embrace this new creation that God was calling me to be. And so those things happened simultaneously. And so I went down to AAA, and just like as a human being, I really scuffled at the beginning. I mean, I was giving up runs galore, man. I couldn't figure it out. I was trying to make it work and it just wasn't happening. But they kept giving me grace, just like my wife would kept giving me grace in my relationship with her. And I started to kind of figure it out a little at a time. And from 2005 to 2010, I kind of bounced up and down as a full-time knuckleballer, which is when I made the transition. And I was still working, with a counselor, and with my wife, we were going through our process together at the same time. And in 2010, I finally had thrown enough knuckleballs where something clicked. And I was with the New York Mets at the time, and I ended up throwing in AAA. I ended up throwing a game where I gave up a leadoff single, the very first batter of the game, and then I retired 27 hitters in a row. And I got called up like 2 days later to the big leagues. And from 2010 until 2017, I never saw another minor league day. And
Wow.
so and unbelievably, miraculously, like that those are the years too that started to become the most rich for me in my marriage. Like I could care less about my vocation really. Like I was committed to it, but all I cared about was how do I be a good man, right? Like how do I reinvent myself as a man, right? I was reinventing myself as a pitcher, yes, and I was God had equipped me to be all in that process. But if I wouldn't have been working on myself with a counselor on the side and figuring out kind of the freedom that comes with being vulnerable and all the things that we've talked about the last hour, I would have never, my trajectory would have never been what it was. Never. If I hadn't, if I hadn't like let go, like I was like this with my career for so long. And it's when I just kind of said, hey, God, if this is what you want me to be, great. If not, I want to commit to this. Like I want to commit to being honest with my wife. I want to commit to being a good father. I want to commit to being a good man. And I know that you're going to provide for my family. And I don't know how you're going to do it, but I trust that. And understanding that piece, I mean, it was just, and I'm not saying that like that was the magic pill. I'm just saying it's more than a coincidence to me that those two things happened simultaneously, almost to the day. And it was a real neat gift that God gave me that, you know, that He is real and He cares about every detail of my life and He cares about, my family. And it did a lot for my faith to be able to see it that way, is all I'm saying. So, I got to enjoy 7 really good years. And like I said, in 2012, I was able to win the Cy Young with the New York Mets. And what a thing to get to celebrate.
Man. So I don't know if I didn't catch that when I saw you speak, but I didn't know that those two things happened simultaneously.
Oh
And it
man,
makes
and I mean to the minute almost, really,
that's
to almost to the
crazy.
minute. Yeah. Yeah.
That is
It was really
crazy.
interesting. Yeah.
It is because, if you really look at a man and what we value most, right? Family and our profession. And
Yeah.
this idea of surrendering to an identity that we think that we should have, or maybe an identity that has gotten us to survive as an individual, for as long as we have, or as a baseball player or whatever. A huge theme that's really emerging from your story is the ability to surrender, to like,
Oh yeah.
okay, I guess this is what I'm called to do. I mean, it's it's very, very difficult, but at the same time, it's a beautiful moment. That's incredible, man.
When I would say additionally, like if you're surrendering, you better make sure what you're surrendering to, right? Like that, it's one thing just to surrender apathetically, like to give up. But when you like authentically surrender, and I think that's something that I talk about a lot, especially with young people, like there's this real freedom that comes with surrender, but not a giving up. It's much more of a replacing what you once trusted with something that's more trustworthy. And that's a big deal. Like that for me was a huge aha moment later in the process for me was, you know, forever I had trusted my own merits and my own, being able to rationalize things. And, I was very erudite. Like I was an academic All-American and I thought I could process my way, you know, academically. And like I had to let go of all that crap. Right. And really place my trust in what God had asked me to place my trust in. And that was a big deal for me, for sure.
Wow. I mean, that just, your story is already so powerful, but the fact that those two things, like literally, if you look at a timeline and what actually was the launching pad for not only your marriage, your family, but also your career, it's incredible, and
Yeah, it's a miracle.
it is. You know, well, first of all, I want to thank you for coming on today, sharing your story, being so authentic. And, this whole theme of surrendering and being authentic for the past 1 hour and 5 minutes, that's all you've been. And I truly appreciate that. And I know the audience does
Ah,
too.
well, thank you. That's an encouragement. It's been a lot of work, and I appreciate your questions and how prepared you were. I mean, it's not, you get to do interviews when you're in doing this stuff, and then you get to do real good interviews. And this is fun for me to get to really, because I know that, you know, I wish that I would have heard something like what we've just discussed when I was 21 years old, or 22 years old or 23 years old, or in that decade where I was really struggling. Like, I wish I would have been able to hear what you and I just discussed. It would have given me some hope. And I think that's the quintessential piece, right? Like you can't lose hope. And I think for a long time I felt real hopeless, and have gotten that back in so many different ways.
I think you're right. I look back, you and I are the same age. And I look back on, my 1996 as well as yours, right? And you're with Ann and I'm with Jess. And I was just completely and totally floundering through it. I mean, there were no podcasts, there were books, but that was
Yeah.
about it. And even back then, like I thinking about it, to go and see a therapist or a counselor, like I remember growing up and man, if your parents were in therapy or if you were in therapy, oh dude, you were doomed. Like there was no life for you, right? And
I know.
now it's like, all you have to do is go on iTunes or Spotify and you get to be a part of a conversation like this. And you're like, oh, wait a second. So I don't have to do these things. There is a better
Yeah.
way, right?
Yeah. And you don't feel
Yeah.
so alone too. Like I remember
Yeah.
feeling so freaking alone, man. Like nobody had ever been abused like me. Right. Like
Yep.
I felt like such a pariah and like less than human. I just and to know, like, to be able to hear, like, that changed me too, right? Like to be in a community with people who have had similar experiences and had similar hardships, that did a lot for me. And they were everywhere. Like the same things bound them up that bound me. And to hear people talk about that in my process, wow. I mean, it was, so this is incredible. Like, so thank you for your questions.
Oh, I appreciate you and thank you back. I want to make sure that all the guys can find you if they want to follow you. And obviously you've got a couple books out there. I love the fact that there's a Knuckleball Ned book out there. That's so cool, man. I just love that. But as far as just your books and just ways for men to connect with you, what is the best way?
Well, that would be the best way. I think you really get a sense of my story, just by picking up a book, and they're real cheap on Amazon. My book came out in 2012, and
Yeah.
it had a good run, and so it's called Wherever I Wind Up: My Search for Truth, Authenticity, and the Perfect Knuckleball. And so you can get it, on Amazon real easy. But that would be a good way to kind of connect with me, just in my story would,
Yeah.
would be to pick that book up.
Yeah. We'll have a link in the show notes for you guys. You can't miss it though. I love the cover. It's you in the Mets
Yeah.
uniform and the ball is in midair. I love that. That's just so
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome,
That
man.
had nothing to do with me.
Man, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure.